The year was 1995. The legendary Windows 95 was released, a newly designed $100 bill entered circulation, the president of Russia continued to amuse the world, and the charming Salma Hayek made her first appearance on the big screen. In general, it was an ordinary year full of both good and bad events. With so much happening around the world, a small research experiment by Norwegian scientists should have gone completely unnoticed. Yet due to this experiment, Salma Hayek might never have done her snake dance the next year, nor would there have been a next year at all. The ordinary launch of a research rocket from Norway, coupled with an extraordinary coincidence, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war as never before. Without any exaggeration, on that day, the fate of all mankind hinged on the decision of just one person, Russian President Boris Yeltsin. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the United States conducted the world's first nuclear weapons test. The subsequent use of 2 nuclear bombs finally put an end to World War II, seemingly bringing the world into a time of peace.
Сфера секрет атомной бомбы, хотя этого секрета давно уже не существует.
However, 4 years later, a nuclear detonation at the Semipalatinsk test site in the USSR marked the end of the US monopoly on nuclear weapons. From then on, any conflict between the USSR and the United States had the potential to escalate into a global nuclear war. Thankfully, during the Cold War, the leaders of both superpowers recognized that the use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic consequences not only for their enemy, but also for all of humanity. And thus, even during the most heated international crisis, the opposing sides always managed to find a common solution without reaching a critical point, which sometimes was so dangerously close. What is interesting, however, is that in this respect, people most often recall the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s, while some might remember the episode with Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who played a key role in the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident. But only a few remember the Norwegian Rocket Incident. Yet during this lesser-known incident, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. What's even more interesting is that this incident occurred not during some specific military conflict, nor even during the Cold War in general, but during a time when nuclear war seemed like a relic of the past, far removed from the present. In 1945, to keep the research teams formed during World War II in Canada as opposed to moving them to the United States, Canada formed the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, or CARDE. Right from the start, the new establishment focused on one of the most promising areas of that time, rocket technologies. The first results of the establishment's work were Canadian models of anti-tank and air-to-air missiles developed in the early 1950s. However, the CARDE's mission was further evolving, and by the late 1950s, they were tasked with developing an anti-ballistic missile which would defend Canada against Soviet nuclear missiles. In 1957, they created the Propulsion Test Vehicle to study new engine designs and fuels, and 2 years later, in 1959, the vehicle made its first launch. Although these studies didn't lead to the development of any particular anti-ballistic missile, they did yield the now world-famous Black Brant sounding rocket, which then found wide use in scientific research. The Black Brant rocket was constantly improving, and if the models in the 60s could carry up to 68 kilograms to an altitude of 150 kilometers, the latest model, the Black Brant 12, is capable of carrying up to 400 kilogram payload to an altitude of 1500 kilometers. This is even higher than the orbits of space shuttles and the International Space Station. But arguably the most remarkable of the Black Brant's characteristics is its exceptional reliability. Out of more than 1,000 launches of this Canadian rocket, less than 2% were unsuccessful, which made the Black Brant one of the most reliable rockets in history. Thanks to its excellent performance and reliability, the Black Brant became a highly popular research rocket in fields like physics, astrophysics, chemistry, and biomedical research in the upper atmosphere and near space. Both the Canadian Space Agency and NASA have used this rocket many times in various experiments, and the scheduled launch of the rocket from Norway on January 25, 1995, as part of a joint American-Norwegian project to study the Northern Lights, shouldn't have been an exception either. The launch of the rocket was yet again successful and would have marked the 607th launch of a Black Brant rocket from the Norwegian Andøya rocket range. However, the scientists' jubilation was all of a sudden interrupted by a phone call. The head of the Andøya rocket range, Kolbjørn Adolfsen, answered the call and learned with horror that their rocket launch had nearly triggered a nuclear war. The 1990s were a time of huge changes. The fall of the Berlin Wall, an iconic image of the Cold War, launched an irreversible change in Eastern Europe, which eventually led to the complete dissolution of the communist system in Europe. The vanished Red Thread led in turn to the gradual withdrawal of American troops from Western Germany. Meanwhile, from the other side of the country, endless trains loaded with Soviet tanks, which had terrified Europe for a while, headed east towards Russia. The withdrawal and the last parade of the Soviet troops in Germany were conducted, in every sense of this word, by the first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. It is worth mentioning that Boris Yeltsin's reputation in the world was slightly ambiguous, to put it mildly. While the Western world praised his role in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the launching of economic reforms, and the first attempts to transform Russia into a democratic society, at the same time it was hard to ignore his eccentric behavior, most often caused by his well-known addiction to alcohol.
Я просто проспал.
Neither was there a clear and definitive attitude to Boris Yeltsin within Russia. In fact, the overall situation in Russia could hardly be called clear and definitive. By 1995, famous world brands had already infiltrated the country. However, Western-style democracy seriously struggled to take root in Russian soil. The political landscape was highly volatile, with less than 2 years passing since the so-called October coup, which had claimed over 100 lives and resulted in the adoption of a new constitution that significantly expanded the authority of the Russian president. In 1995, in addition to serious political and economic problems, the situation in Chechnya was getting way worse. On top of that, Russia's prestige on the world stage suffered a huge blow. Despite the end of the Cold War and seeming easing of tensions, NATO announced its potential expansion to the east, encompassing former Warsaw Pact countries and some former Soviet republics. And mighty Russia found surprisingly that its objections carried little to no weight, especially in the organization it was not even a member of. Oh, those good old days when the civilized world didn't have Teslas and Twitter X, though it had the wisdom and balls to show Russia its real place. Anyway, this blow deeply wounded Russia, in particular its military, as it became evident that the rest of the world refused to believe in a peaceful Russia, and the Cold War's tension, although significantly weakened, were still existent. And it was exactly in this intense moment that an unidentified missile appeared on Russian military radars. On January 25, 1995, at around 9:30 a.m., Russian missile defense radars detected an unknown object. To be fair, though, it was unknown only to the Russian military. The Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs had twice notified more than 30 countries, including Russia, about the impending launch of a sounding rocket from the Norwegian rocket range Andøya. These notifications specified in particular the launch site and potential areas where the rocket would drop its boosters. However, they did not include the exact date and time of the launch, as they were dependent on weather conditions, which was common practice at the time. However, for some unknown reason, this information did not reach the Russian military, or at least the personnel of the radar stations. The unknown missile obviously raised concerns among the Russian military. One of the problems was that it was impossible to determine the exact launch site, but only an estimated area with a margin of error of several dozen kilometers. But the worst thing was that the assumed missile launch location coincided with one of the most likely scenarios for a nuclear missile attack. It looked like the launch of a ballistic missile from a nuclear submarine in the Norwegian Sea. To be fair, the Black Brant launched that day from Norway was not an average research rocket, so to speak. It was the Black Brant 12, a massive 15-meter 4-stage sounding rocket. Observing an object traveling at high speed along a steep trajectory, shedding stages along the way, Russian radar operators understandably mistook it for a war missile. The trajectory resembled that of a submarine-launched Trident missile, back then in service with the US Navy. The missile initial flight trajectory indicated a potential range of 3,500 kilometers, thus putting Moscow within its potential strike radius. While a single missile might not have constituted a massive attack, the launch of a single missile on a high ballistic trajectory from the Norwegian Sea fit exactly one of the scenarios for a surprise nuclear attack on Russia. In this scenario, a missile carrying a special nuclear warhead would explode high in the air over Russia, generating an extremely powerful electromagnetic pulse, which would fry all electronics like computers, communication systems, surveillance radars, enabling a massive nuclear attack on Russia without fear of retaliation. Following established protocols, the early warning radar operators immediately alerted the Russian General Staff about the missile threat. The threat was taken very seriously, and all Russian strategic missile forces were placed on full alert. The command and control system of Russia's strategic nuclear forces was automatically activated, including the mobile terminal Cheget, commonly known as the nuclear briefcase. The Russian president was informed of the potential missile threat, and Boris Yeltsin activated his terminal. It was the first and thus far only known incident where any nuclear weapon state had its nuclear briefcase activated and prepared to launch an attack. At that moment, just a single push of a button separated the world from a nuclear apocalypse. According to the protocols of the time, the president of Russia had only 10 minutes to decide on a retaliatory strike. This was the amount of time that enemy nuclear missiles needed to reach Russian territory and cause extensive damage. Other than the president's briefcase, two more similar terminals were put in use during this incident, one by Defense Minister Pavel Grachev and the other by Chief of General Staff Mikhail Kolesnikov. All three were engaged in a telephone conference call, however, the exact details of their conversation remain unknown. Some sources suggest that the Russian leaders eventually realized there was no actual nuclear threat, while others claim that the Russian defense minister pushed the president for a missile strike on the United States and Norway. Fortunately, Boris Yeltsin exercised restraint and did not rush into any decisions. Around the 8th minute of the incident, he received confirmation that the missile was moving away from Russian territory and no longer posed a threat. 8 minutes out of the possible 10, which meant that on that day, only 2 minutes separated the world from a possible nuclear war. It is the tight timing that makes the Norwegian rocket incident so unique. Acute crises between the two superpowers had happened before, but they all developed gradually, allowing leaders ample time to make well-considered decisions. The Norwegian incident, however, placed Boris Yeltsin in an extraordinarily challenging position with only a few minutes to decide on action or inaction. This is why many regard the Norwegian incident as one of the most dangerous events in history. What is interesting is that the world came so close to nuclear annihilation not during the Cold War, when the tension between the USA and the USSR was at its peak, not during the Berlin or Cuban Missile Crisis, not during multiple wars in the Middle East or Asia, but rather during a relatively peaceful time driven by a bizarre coincidence coupled with Russian disarray. It's unsettling to contemplate what might happen if a similar incident occurred today, when such a thing as common sense can hardly be applicable not only to some leaders, but also to a whole nation wickedly urging nuclear war. Of course, the active promotion of the nuclear war theme by Russian national TV channels and media is quite explainable. In reality, the probability of Russia initiating a nuclear war, not by accident but deliberately, is extremely low. And it appears to me that both NATO and Russian leadership understand this well. However, this inflated belligerence allows the Russian leadership to accomplish two important goals: to keep their population in a sick ecstasy over what the entire world supposedly fears about them, and simultaneously to intimidate the population of the West, hoping to pressure Western politicians into backing down due to public opinion. Perhaps as a Ukrainian I find it easier to perceive such threats, as we sometimes say what everyone else considers the end of the world, for Ukrainians is just another Tuesday. But for the average Westerner, the effect will be different, and it's interesting to see how Russia's narratives are transmitted to the Western audience. For instance, one of the recent such threats, uttered by the former head of the FSB and now Russia's Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev, was covered by at least 15 news sources. What's intriguing is that 54% of the reporting originates from sources politically leaning to the right, and almost 0% from the left. If you compare the headlines, you may notice something interesting. On the left, there is a neutral headline about the increased risk from weapons of mass destruction, according to Patrushev. However, on the right, the headlines claim that the West is increasing the risk of weapons of mass destruction being used. So according to this narrative, it's not the fault of Russia who initiated this aggression against Ukraine and is causing the death of innocent people every day. It's you guys in the West who are helping the victim of the aggression and thus escalating the risk of a nuclear war. And if you are afraid of it, it's you who should stop. To be honest, as someone whose personal values, I believe, have always leaned more to the right, to the forces that historically managed to defeat Soviet Russia, this breakdown of news coverage was a bit surprising.
We cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, a nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one.
But on the other hand, I greatly appreciate every chance to challenge some of my own assumptions. And this is all possible thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the factuality and ownership of the sources reporting, political bias, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And I especially like the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. Because it's important to know what's circulating online in echo chambers instead of being in the dark about misleading media narratives on both sides. And with the Ground News Vantage plan, you get all of their features plus access to the My News Bias feature, which is basically a dashboard for your news diet, where you can see how your reading habits changed, your top sources, and whether you're seeing diverse perspectives. For a limited time only, if you use my link in the description, in addition to the standard discount for Paper Skies fans, you will receive an exclusive Black Friday offer of 40% off the Ground News Vantage subscription. Just click on the link that's on the screen right now or down in the description. You will get a fascinating and more objective look at the news and help support independent and transparent reporting. And as always, you will support my channel as well. So to get 40% off, just click on the link below, and thank you so much for watching.